Cool. All right. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Good morning. So my name is John Alexander. I'm the Senior Product Director at Level 3. I run the media products at Level 3 Communications. So for those of you who don't know Level 3, we're a large telco company. We operate a global fiber backbone, large IP network, and some media products as well. So within that portfolio, there's two key products. There's our content delivery network, but also another business we call Vivix, which is our broadcast video transmission service. So today what I'm going to talk about is more related to the CDN and specifically the OTT market. And what we're going to do is share some of the data that we've got internally from our network, talk about how we look at the data, and then some of the insights that we get from that. So before I get into the data itself, or the network data, at least here's a market survey report that we put out a couple of months back, just giving some context for rise of OTT. So again, I think most people are going to be familiar with a lot of this data. The piece that I particularly like is that sort of first bullet, top left. So we surveyed about 500 people. I think this might be a little bit optimistic, but 70% of the respondents estimated that OTT video consumption minutes will surpass broadcast within 5 years, so by 2022. So pretty significant shift from where we are today. If you look at data from someone like Nielsen, they're saying it's about 16% of video minutes are consumed OTT today. If this is accurate, we're going to see more than half of that by 2022, so a big shift. So let's get into some of our data and what we're looking at. And first off, how we look at the data. So we're a CDN. We have a server-side view of what's going on. I can see some folks here in the audience who have a view from a different angle, from the client side. But everything I'm going to talk about here is solely from the server side. So server logs that we then run through this processing pipeline. We're capturing about 5 million requests per second. So reasonable scale here. We're processing through Kafka, streaming that data into Spark, where we do most of the computation. Then we have two ways of analyzing the data. So Zeppelin is great for the ad hoc queries. It gives you a SQL type interface on top of the data. So if you're exploring the data, if you're analyzing, if you're looking at specific anomalies, issues, it's a great way of querying around a topic to find the piece of data that's relevant. And then Grafana is a great dashboarding tool that we use on top of the Spark data. So once we've got a set of data that we like, we use Grafana for the dashboard. So a lot of the charts you'll see in here are probably coming out of that Grafana interface. So first off, just looking at the overall traffic. First off, just pretty solid growth going back over 5 years. This chart goes back to January 2012, coming through to Friday. I updated this on Friday last week, so pretty up to date. One of the key points I wanted to make here, you see there's kind of the noise on the signal there, oscillation around the kind of the trend line. Anyone got any idea what that oscillation is? Each of these data points is a daily P95 value. Anyone know what the oscillation is? Any guesses? No? I mean, it's if you look at the signal, it's happening pretty frequently, so it's not one time. So I'm talking about kind of the noise you see on the signal going through. Kind of. I mean, it's so it's the weekly pattern that we see. Typically, Sunday is the busiest day on our network. So we see this sort of 7-day cycle. Saturday's a big day, certainly in Europe. We have a lot of soccer matches going on in Europe, especially. But driven by OTT consumption, Sundays are the busiest days on our network. So this chart is all-in traffic that we have on the network. So drilling in a lot more now just into video sessions. And I picked 3 days pretty much at random. These were picked to be representative of a typical traffic pattern that we see. So this is, again, kind of almost 2 weeks ago. It's a Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday earlier this month. And again, kind of a couple points to call out here. Each day looks pretty much the same as the day before. Who can explain that weird sort of double hump on the chart? Get any guesses? It is a time of day factor, but why would you see kind of video consumption follow that pattern? I'll give you a clue. This is a global chart. It's not lunchtime and home time. It's well, what you actually see, the first sort of smaller hump is peak hours in Europe, and then you have the North America peak coming behind. So as we look globally at our network, as you follow the sun through, you kind of see traffic rising during the day. You hit a European peak. Europeans go to bed. You're still hitting the tail end of the working day in the US, and you're still ramping into the peak hours. So what we typically see is 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. is peak hours in the local time zone. So as you look across the US and you follow through kind of Eastern time zone all the way across the Pacific, you have kind of a spread out window starting at 6 p.m. Eastern, going through to about 1 a.m., 2 a.m. Eastern time for that peak. The other point just to kind of note is obviously the peak to trough in the chart is pretty substantial. So we're seeing about 3 million video sessions per hour at peak, and it drops down to less than 1 million at the lowest point. And again, just to clarify, when we're talking here, we're talking about sessions now. So these aren't requests. We've aggregated all the requests that we see, stitched that all together to track a session in the server-side log data. So that's interesting as we look in aggregate, but what we see is there's a very fragmented ecosystem of devices we're delivering to. So those 3 million sessions we're delivering at peak, in that sample we looked at over those 3 days, there were 125,000 unique user agents that we delivered to. So again, we're looking at server-side data, so the best way we have to identify our client is the user agent string that's provided in the HTTP request to us. We have to map that down to something that's meaningful. So looking at 125,000 unique user string variants isn't particularly meaningful for us. But what we're able to do is, on top of that Spark infrastructure, aggregate those user agents down into these key devices. This is a logarithmic scale here, and you can see by device family the distribution or the popularity of what we were seeing by device family. And again, I'll caveat this is just for 3 days, just on our network. It's not necessarily representative of the entire internet or even of a weekend. So take the data with that in mind. But pretty interesting for us when we looked at this was 125,000 unique device fingerprints that we saw in total. 100,000 of those were Android. So again, think about the Android ecosystem. You've got all the various phones, tablets, set-top boxes. All of the apps that run on top of those platforms can also present a unique user agent and look like a different device. And so the way we look at this data, we get it down as these device families. And then we start to look at it across the time of day. So the chart at the top here, and I've drilled down to just US now here, so you don't see the double peak. We're just looking at the US peak. The chart at the top is just breaking out those sessions by time of day. And kind of as you'd expect, it follows the distribution that we saw before on the global session data. So peak hours, you see an increase. It broadly follows with the distribution of devices. There are some variations. So the chart at the bottom shows the distribution as a percentage of the total. So what you see as you get during the peak hours, Android actually takes up a slightly larger share. So Android is the kind of gold, larger section of the chart, and then the web sessions are the pink or purple version. So you actually see that Android takes up a little bit more of the share at peak hours there, but not a significant variation. So the next thing we look at, sorry, this was just showing the sessions by as a percentage of the total. So we talked about the number of unique devices that we saw. This is as a percentage of the sessions. So people pulling content from our network, those 3 million sessions that we see at peak, the majority are coming from web platforms, people on their PCs, tablets, using a browser to access the content. That's still the majority. Android follows pretty quickly behind. Then interestingly, Roku is the kind of the single largest dedicated streaming device that we see. We've broken out Apple TV and iOS separately. So iOS is really iPhone and iPad. Apple TV is just the Apple TV platform. So if you put those two together, really as an indication of the Apple family, still behind Android, but a significant share of the overall. And then as you go further down, I was surprised to see Amazon Fire as high up as they were. Smart TV is still a way down, PlayStation towards the bottom, and Xbox in that other category. So the next thing we look at then is the rebuffering. And so let me talk a little bit about how we calculate rebuffering. So we're looking just from the server side. We're delivering packets. We're answering requests for content. We don't have any software on the client. We don't have any visibility of what's going on in the client. But we're one end of a TCP connection. So there's a lot we can infer from that connection, how that client's requesting data from us to understand what's going on. We look at things like the interpacket arrival rates. We look at the delay. We look at TCP windows. And from that, we aggregate all that together to infer the rebuffering. We've done a lot of work to correlate this against data from third parties and customers where they have client-side metrics. And we're pretty happy with the correlation that we see. The great thing for us is that we can do this 100% server-side. We don't need any external data for us. So as we think about how we optimize delivery on our network, from the data that we're collecting, all of those server-side logs, we're able to process that down to a pretty interesting view of rebuffering. And from what we see, from what we've heard from all of our clients, rebuffering is the key QoE metric that our customers and their end users are looking at. So as we focus on optimizing performance, rebuffering is the key metric we look at. So this is the same 3-day period we looked at before. If you remember from the session chart, you had roughly equivalent sessions on each day. Interestingly, you see there's a spike in the rebuffering on the Tuesday. So something happened on that day where across all platforms we saw an increase in the amount of rebuffering. And then as you went into Wednesday, it dropped, and Thursday dropped down again. So I didn't massage this data, I didn't pick it specifically, but this is typically what we see when we're looking at how we optimize the network. We'll find some kind of anomaly like this that will stick out, and then that helps us focus in our engineering work to improve the platform. The chart at the bottom is a little bit complicated to explain, so let me try and do this, and I might need to have a go if it's not clear. So this is really a probability view of the likelihood of having a rebuffering event on a given device. So think about it as weighted by the number of sessions that each device has. This is the probability that that device will have a rebuffering event. So some devices obviously have a lot more sessions than other devices, and therefore they have more rebuffering. But as a percentage, it may be higher or lower. What this shows is across a device connecting, and so think of this as an end user perspective. If you want to choose a device to consume content with, this tells you which device by a given time of day is going to be more likely to have a rebuffering event during this 3-day window connected to level 3's network. So just so that very isolated view of the data that we have. So what's interesting is it doesn't correlate closely with the number of sessions, maybe as you'd expect, but if you remember the chart we had before, and I'll just flip back to that, you see Android and web were the majority of the sessions, that we're carrying. As you come down here now, Android is actually just that gold, just above the green at the bottom of the chart. Web is the kind of pinky purple color further up, but representing a much smaller share of the rebuffering probability space than of the session landscape. So as we then look at this and rank this, this is a kind of just a stack ranked view of each of those device families. And again, looking at the percentage of the overall sessions that had a rebuffering event. And so when we talk about rebuffering, that session could go on for an hour. Typically, most of the session, or the average session duration that we're seeing is just over 40 minutes in the sample that we looked at. We're saying if there's a single rebuffering event, that session is marked as a rebuffered session. So of all the sessions, if there's 100 sessions, we're saying, well, roughly 1 out of 100 is having some kind of a rebuffering event. In this data sample here, Android was the best performing with the lowest probability of having a rebuffering event, which is pretty phenomenal when you think about the ecosystem that Android's sitting on top of. So all of those hardware variants, all of the different capabilities of those devices. And then as you move down, PlayStation actually at the bottom of that list. And again, what we see is typically the way the applications and the SDKs sit on top of these hardware devices. Even though the PlayStation's got great hardware and very powerful device, often the streaming implementation on top of those devices can be, or can introduce more variability in the performance. So that's my kind of end of the run through the data. So just kind of 2 points I want to finish with, and then I'll open up to some questions. First off, around the pattern of consumption. So if you look at the charts of kind of when people are consuming, and as we look at this by different countries, I'm mainly focused on US data here, but as we look across different countries, it follows similar cycles. So there's the 7-day cycle that we saw, where typically a Sunday is the busiest day on our network for video consumption, and also the daily pattern as well. So 4 a.m. is typically the low point on our network, and 10 p.m. is typically the peak, 10 p.m. is kind of just coming to the end of the peak video consumption. So really 6 to 10 p.m., that window is the peak viewing hours. The second key point, and certainly as we think about this as a network provider, a service provider, and how we optimize our service, is around this fragmented device ecosystem. As we deliver content to different devices, we see very different experience on those devices. They pull content in different ways. They have different characteristics, different heuristics in their players that interact with our network in a different way. Even at very fundamental levels, you have a difference in video formats. HLS versus Dash versus Smooth behave very differently. And most importantly, so how we measure whether we're doing a good job is through the rebuffering metrics. A lot of our customers measure us that way and look at the rebuffering metrics as a key performance indicator. As we look across devices, we can see some pretty substantial variations in those devices. So within our engineering teams, we're starting to get now into a very granular level. 2 years ago, we were looking kind of more broadly at just Dash or just HLS and looking at how we optimize that traffic as a whole. By network, by metro, by country, we're able to drill in at a network level, but only at a format level. Where we're now at, we're drilling in further within that to individual device level optimizations, which complicates the problem significantly, but opens up some different avenues for us to improve the performance. So I'm going to stop there and see if there's any questions. Yes?
Can you shed some light on, or at a granular level on, what protocol or what codec format may cause issues with respect to like the rebuffering and things like that, or is that, does a specific issue cause that problem at those
Yeah, okay. So yeah, I mean, the question is around kind of shedding some light on what causes the rebuffering. Is it down to formats, devices, time of day? So I think the easy answer is all of the above. So a lot of it's still down to the network. So I said kind of 2-3 years ago, we were very focused on which AS we're delivering to and which city. And we still see that as the primary driver of performance variation. So if we're delivering to Verizon in New York and we're delivering to AT&T in Chicago, we see those networks have very different characteristics. We see that the way we connect with those networks have different characteristics. That content originates from different servers on our network, and we can see that that causes variations in the performance as well. So that's the first thing. Maybe getting more into the device level, we certainly see that there are trade-offs that some of our customers make that can have an impact on the video rebuffering metric, so that key metric that we looked at. So things like the chunk duration, if you're using an HTTP fragmented adaptive bitrate video. Typically, a longer chunk size is more consistent and can deliver a better buffering experience. If you're doing live streaming, again, increasing the latency, increasing the buffer sizes helps. We see in some of the clients, they have a very aggressive algorithm to upshift bitrate to try and maximize the picture quality. And some of our clients do this intentionally. They've created very valuable content. They want it to look as good as possible. They want to deliver it in a 1080p variant whenever they can. But by being aggressive around that and not being conservative around network conditions, they can create issues because they're making that trade-off, trying to deliver a better picture quality versus consistency. So I think we're out of time, so I apologize. Grab me afterwards if there's any more questions. Thank you.